morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that this is another week where Vice Chair Carr's, the back of his head and the back of my head are famous, so you're being streamed live over the internet. We'll go ahead and start with our briefing. We have Hiram Birch from DLS to discuss state aid to local governments. And we have a microphone that we are now asking folks at the table to use. And if you need any assistance, of course, Sarah will run down there and make sure it's okay.
Good morning, members of the Montgomery County House Delegation. My name is Arnold Aja, and I'm a policy analyst intern at the Department of Legislative Services. I'm a longtime county resident and former intern with the county's IGR office with Melanie Wenger and her wonderful staff. Next to me is Hiram Birch, one of our legislative managers and expert on all things state aid. Funnily enough, it was a year ago that I met Hiram after a briefing in this same delegation. So I thank you all for this opportunity and for giving me this platform. In front of you, you will find two packets. One is a highlights report that basically summarizes the state aid to Montgomery County, and the other is our full overview of the state aid to local governments report. For this briefing, I will direct you to the full report, overview of the state aid. So if you would please turn to page 1. As you can see on page 1, state aid to local governments accounts for a large portion of the state budget, representing approximately 38% of general funds and 26% of state funds. As a point of reference, if you look at the table at the bottom of page 1, you will see that entitlement spending accounts for over 20% of general funds, and state agencies account for 40.1% of general funds. If you turn to page 2, we'll see that the state aid to local governments will total $8 billion in fiscal 2020. Direct aid to public schools will total $6 billion, which represents 75.6% of the total state aid. Retirement payments to public school teachers, librarians, and community college faculty will total over $835 million, which represents 10.5% of the total state aid. And funding for county and municipal governments will total $701.4 million, which is 8.8% of the total state aid. Compared to fiscal 2019, state aid to local governments will increase by approximately $300 million, which represents a 3.9% increase over the prior year. Direct education aid increases by $216.9 million, which is a 3.7% increase, and retirement payments increased by $37.6 million, or 4.7%. Funding for county and municipal governments increases by $33 million, or 4.9%. On page 3, page 3 shows you the allocation of state funding by jurisdiction. All jurisdictions receive an increase in state aid in fiscal 2020. The annual change in state aid ranges from 1.1% in Baltimore City to 8.4% in Caroline County. State aid to Montgomery County increases by 4%. On a per capita basis, state aid ranges from $656 in Talbot County to over $2,000 in Baltimore City and Caroline County. This variation in per capita funding reflects the state policy to provide greater financial assistance to jurisdictions with the lower capacity to generate revenues from local sources. So around 70% of state aid to local governments is allocated based on local wealth factor. primarily the local property and the income wall. This fiscal policy results in Montgomery County being in the lower quartile with the per capita at $955.
One thing I do want to point out as we go through the presentation is that all of the mandated state aid programs are fully funded in the governor's budget. He has also provided an additional $11.8 million in hold harmless grants, and that primarily goes to Baltimore City, and that would keep Baltimore City's public schools from actually having a decrease in funding. So when you look at on page 3 that all jurisdictions are getting an increase in funding, if it wasn't for their hold harmless grant for the Baltimore City public school system, their school system was actually getting a decrease in funding. But once again, all of the state aid programs are fully funded, and the governor has put in some additional funds.
Pages 4 through 7 provide more detail on the level of state funding in fiscal 2019 and 2020 by a unit of local government. Pages 8 through 10 illustrate the trend in state aid by unit of local government. As you can see on page 9, over the last 10 years, state aid increases by $1.7 billion. Most of this funding goes to public schools, who received an additional $1.3 billion over this period. Page 11 shows the allocation of police aid by jurisdiction. So police aid funding totals $74.8 million statewide in fiscal 2020. Jurisdictions in Montgomery County will receive $16.5 million in police aid in fiscal 2020.
And you would notice on page 11 that on a per capita basis, Montgomery County receives more funding than the state average. It's due to the fact that if you turn to page 12, you would notice that around 70% of the funds are based on population density. So this is one state aid program that does not incorporate a local wealth measure. So the funds that goes to the Montgomery County Police Department and to the municipal police departments is based on population density, which is around 70% of the funds. An additional around 5% of the funds goes to municipal police departments. So jurisdictions with a higher population density receives more funding on a per capita basis. More rural areas receive less funding through the population density grant. Some of them have municipal police departments and receives funding through that component. But unlike most education funding, the police aid formula, and also if we talk about the highway user formula, does not incorporate local wealth measure.
Page 13.
Let's wait, let's hold questions to the end. That's all right, talk about this.
Page 13 shows the targeted crime funding. State funding for targeted crime totals $35.6 million in fiscal 2020. Around $20 million of this is received by Baltimore City and Prince George's County. The remaining $15.4 million is provided for statewide funding. Page 14 illustrates the fire and rescue aid. The fiscal 2020 budget includes $15 million in fire and rescue aid funding. Jurisdictions in Montgomery County will receive $2 million in fire and rescue aid in fiscal 2020. Page 15 shows the allocation of local health grants. Local health grants will total $55.4 million statewide in fiscal 2020, and Montgomery County will receive $4.1 million in local health grants in fiscal 2020. Pages 16 and 17 show the trends in local highway user funding. Page 16 shows the total state funding for highway user revenues for fiscal 2010 through fiscal 2020. Highway user revenues will total $255.9 million in fiscal 2020. Of this amount, $14.3 million is provided to jurisdictions in Montgomery County. Page 18 shows the county and municipal share of highway user revenues for fiscal 2020. So the Montgomery County will receive $8.2 million, and its jurisdictions will receive $6.1 million in fiscal 2020.
And you can see from this exhibit that a large share of the funds for this program goes to Baltimore City. The historical rationale has been that unlike the other 23 counties in Baltimore City, they're responsible for maintaining all of the roads within Baltimore City. As in the other 23 counties, there are state highways, interstates that are maintained by MDOT, and so therefore a larger percentage of the funds should be allocated to Baltimore City. When you look at the funds for the other 23 jurisdictions, the formula incorporates two mechanisms to allocate the funds. It's based on road mileage and vehicle registration. So that is how the funds are allocated for the other jurisdictions. It's based on a very tight formula. The allocation for Baltimore City is just based on a provision in state law that says that 8.3% of the funds goes to Baltimore City. For the other jurisdictions, they get 5.2% of the transportation trust funds that are allocated to local governments. And in total, around 13.5% of the transportation trust fund is allocated to local governments through the local highway user formula. And that's based on legislation enacted last year by the General Assembly to enhance funding for this program.
Pages 19 through 22 provide detail on the disparity grant funding.
And that is a program that provides funding to low wealth counties based on local revenue attainment from a local income tax. Maryland is one of the few states in the country that allows local governments to tax income for local purposes. In most states, the income tax is solely a state revenue source. Local governments doesn't have access to that. So by allowing local governments in Maryland to have access to that, the state provides a grant to the jurisdictions that have low income wealth to kind of compensate for their inability to collect as much money from that local revenue source as high wealth counties. So there's a few, Baltimore City and a few jurisdictions receives funding under that program.
Page 23 illustrates the allocation of gaming impact grants. Now I am going to turn our focus to education aid. As shown on page 24, state education aid will total $6.8 billion in fiscal 2020. Local school systems in Montgomery County will receive over $900 million in state funding in fiscal 2020. Of this amount, $740.8 is for direct aid, which pays for operating expenses within the classroom. In addition, $162.5 million is provided for teacher retirement payments. On a per pupil basis, Montgomery County receives over $5,700 in state education aid. Several factors, including student enrollment and local wealth, help to explain the level of state education aid for local school systems. Page 25 shows the breakdown of direct aid and retirement payments. Pages 28 and 29 show the components of the foundation program. As you can see on page 28, the foundation program totals $3.1 billion in fiscal 2020. Of this amount, $368.2 million is provided to jurisdictions in Montgomery County. page 29 puts the foundation program on a per pupil basis. As you will notice that Montgomery County is in the lowest quartile.
And what I want to bring up is that there's a reason why the state is providing more funding to the low wealth counties. Because around half the funding for public schools, when you look at total state funding and total local funding, around half the money funding public schools comes from local sources and around half comes from the state. The less wealthy counties are less able to collect as much revenue from their local tax bases. So that is why, for example, we provide more funding to the less wealthy counties. In fiscal 2019, for example, I'm just comparing Montgomery County to Somerset County. Somerset County is on the eastern shore. It's one of the least wealthy counties. Somerset County, like Montgomery, imposes the 3.2% local income tax, the highest local tax they can have. They also impose a $1 property tax, which is also which is slightly above the rate in Montgomery County. But when you look at even though their tax rates are at basically Montgomery County's level, when you look at the funding sources for their public school system, Somerset County can only provide around $3,600 in support, and in Montgomery County, the local sources is over $10,000. So that is why the state gives more money to Somerset, less to Montgomery. So when you put in both the state piece and the local piece, Somerset County and Montgomery County basically has the same amount of revenues to fund their public school system. So it enables more equity across the state, particularly for jurisdictions that do impose the more higher tax rates.
Page 31 shows the components of targeted programs for at-risk students. In fiscal 2020, targeted programs for at-risk students total $1.9 billion. As you can see, Montgomery County will receive $262.4 million in state education funding for at-risk populations. We can now shift to page 39. And pages 39 through 42 will provide information on student enrollment. On page 39, you can see that student enrollment increases by 0.6% in Montgomery County compared to the statewide increase of 0.3%.
And this is giving around 1,000 additional students for your public school system, which is the second largest increase in students statewide. Only Howard County is realizing a larger increase in the number of students for their public school system, and Montgomery County is in the top 10 for the percent increase in your public school system. So unlike some other school systems like Baltimore City that is losing over 1,000 students, in Montgomery County you're gaining over 1,000 students.
If you turn to page 40, you will see that just under 1/3 of public school students at Montgomery County are approved for free and reduced price meals, compared to the statewide average of 42.4%. As you can see on page 41, Montgomery County has the second highest share of English language learners in Maryland, representing 17% of student enrollment. Nevertheless, Montgomery County features in the lowest quartile when it comes to increase in the change from year in English learners. Turning to page 42, you will see that 12.6% of public school students in Montgomery County are receiving special education services, which is around the state average of 12.7%. Now we are going to turn your focus to the local wealth measure. If you would please like to refer, I would like to refer you to page 37. The state utilizes a local wealth measure which takes both into account both the property wealth and the income wealth to distribute most education funding. This policy ensures that local school systems have adequate funding to provide educational services to their students, and that the level of education services is not based solely on the tax base of each jurisdiction. In aggregate, the composition of the local wealth measure is approximately 2/3 property and 1/3 income, which reflects the actual revenue collection ratio in most jurisdictions. As you'll see, Montgomery County is ranked 4th with the local wealth per pupil at 41% above the state average. This concludes my presentation, and I'm open to questions, but before that, I will direct you to the highlights package, and at the end, you will find detailed summary charts of the state aid by program given to Montgomery County.
And I just want to make one further comment on our local wealth measure. How the local wealth measure is calculated in Maryland is, like Arnold says, is around 2/3 property and 1/3 income. And when you look at the revenue attainment from those two revenue sources, it kind of mirrors the actual attainment at the local level. And that's kind of what you want. You want your local wealth measure to actually measure the local revenues that are coming in and the capacity to collect revenues from that sources. So how we measure local wealth is we collect actual practice, which is what you want. So we should feel pretty good with how we are measuring local wealth. And one other point is just to go back to the example from Montgomery and Somerset County. Even though both jurisdictions has the 3.2% income tax rate, on a per capita basis, Montgomery County collects around $1,400 in revenue. And that's revenue that can go fund the public school system. In Somerset County, they collect less than $300 per capita from that source. So that just shows you that while Maryland is one of the wealthier states in the country, with the highest median household income, some jurisdictions, particularly in Western Maryland and in the Eastern Shore, their tax base is very, very low, and they're not really able to fund their services with their local tax base. And that's when the state steps in, particularly services like education and public schools. That's a constitutional requirement. It's the state government has the constitutional requirement to provide that service. So they have stepped in to those jurisdictions to give them the resources to fund schools kind of equivalent across the state.
Gentlemen, thank you. Before we do questions, we have a couple of reps from Prince George's County who are here, and they have some late filed bills. We want to do the hearings on those briefly so they can get over to their own delegation meeting. So would you mind just sitting back down for just a couple of minutes before we do questions? Thank you. I appreciate the flexibility. And if we could bring up Tiffany Harvey and Delegate Barnes' aide, I apologize, I don't know your name, sir, to do at least 2 of our 3 late filed bill request hearings. Why don't we start with MC/PG 115-19, which I think, Ms. Harvey, you're going to present on. Why is the bill late?
Well, the bill was filed after our county executive was sworn into office, which was on December 3rd, which was after the filing date. So that is why this bill was filed late. And good morning, and thank you all for having me. I hope that's a sufficient explanation.
We're about to find out.
Second.
All in favor of accepting MC/PG 115-19 late, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any nays? All right, the bill is accepted for late file. Thank you. Sorry, I just got to take these deadlines very seriously. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for the remainder members of the delegation.
Everyone but me. Sir, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before we do the hearing on MC/PG 112-19.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Addison Pruitt, Chief of Staff for Delegate Barnes. Happy to be here to speak on behalf of the bill for Delegate Barnes. MC/PG 112. It was submitted late. It was actually at the request of Prince George's County County Council by Councilman Mel Franklin. We would love for it to be pre-filed, but we received this request late, as he was also sworn into office as well. Hope to receive a favorable report from everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.
I know Councilman Franklin changed what council seat he was holding, but how long has he been in office?
He's been in office, what, 8 years, I want to say, but he's at large now.
Is there a second? All in favor of accepting MC/PG 112-19 late, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any noes? I'm a no. Great. The bill is accepted for late file. And I'm sorry, Ms. Harvey, are you going to do 113-19 on behalf of Senator Pinsky as well? Or?
I am not. I was solely doing the county executive bills.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both for coming over. Sorry to keep you waiting for all that.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Let's bring back up our friends from DLS and thank you folks for waiting. I know Delegate Lopez is first at bat with a question.
So first off, thank you so much for a very comprehensive document. I can tell we'll use it as a reference in the future. On page 11, you're talking about the police aid funding formula. It's limited as, based on the capita. My question is this money used for CED or is this money used for other purposes?
The money is provided to either the county police department and also to municipal police departments. I believe it goes for operating expenses, but I can get back to you on exactly how the funds are being used.
Is it up to each county to use at their discretion, or is it?
I will have to get back to you on that. I do believe that it's just discretionary funding, so I don't think there's really strings attached to it. I do know for the fire aid, I think it has to be used for certain purposes. So.
Thank you.
No other questions?
When you were talking about the page 29, for people funding under the foundation and guaranteed tax-based programs, and you talked about how Somerset has the same sort of rate that Montgomery does. Which counties don't?
Okay. On page 4 of your highlights page, we have a little snippet on tax passing effort. Around 8 jurisdictions currently have the maximum 3.2%, and that covers around half the state's population. It's Baltimore City, Caroline, Howard, Montgomery, Prince George's, Queen Anne's, Somerset, and Wicomico. So when you look at the political makeup of these jurisdictions, some are Republican jurisdictions and some are Democratic jurisdictions. So it's not really, some are rural counties, some are urban counties. Around 2/3 of the state has an income tax rate of at least 3%, which is 15 jurisdictions. So the majority of counties in Maryland have at least a 3% local income tax rate.
Other questions? I'm sorry, what page were you looking at there?
This one,
In our highlights, is on page 4. Just to let you know, all of this information is also on the DLS website. So if you go back to your communities, if people want information, you could access our state aid section of our website, and these highlight points are available to be downloaded.
Other questions? Great. Thank you both again for joining us. We're glad to see there's life after interning for no winner. We'll now move on to our committee reports. Delegate Queen.
Good morning. So the Education, Elections, and Housing Committee voted out NC 2919. This bill is enabling legislation to allow Montgomery County Council to adopt a ranked choice or approval method for certain local elections. And so the committee added an amendment to the bill just to ask that if the bill is enacted, that the local government would provide an educational campaign to make sure that the electorate knows how the differences and importance in the use of ranked choice and or approval method voting. This was voted out 5-0 favorable with the amendment, and we moved to adopt the motion.
So, guys, when you adopt the amendment before you, so you move the amendment?
We have to move the amendment first? Okay. We'll move it, move that the amendment be accepted. Second?
Any discussion on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great.
Second, move the bill.
Second?
Second.
Discussion, Delegate Kaiser?
I have a question to Chair Queen in terms of, did we hear from our County Board of Elections in terms of costs and how this may impact the machines that we're already using and the both types of machines that we're using?
We did not receive any information from them on that, as I understood. No.
The bill was actually introduced, it's a reintroduction of the bill from last year, so I can get you the fiscal note on that from last year. I'll give you some approximation of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't hear any concerns from the county.
Any other questions? No, good luck.
I believe Tacoma Park does this, Maine does this, do any other jurisdictions do this?
What's familiar? So there's two types of voting methods authorized by the bill. Internationally, Ireland, Australia have used this for many years. San Francisco, Berkeley, Minneapolis, a number of other municipalities throughout the U.S. That's RCV. The approval voting, the only jurisdiction I've heard of so far that's approved approval voting is Fargo, but they just approved it in the fall election, so it hasn't been approved.
Delegate Barnett?
And it's important to note with respect to approval voting is very similar to the House of Delegates elections that we have currently, where you get to vote for 3 people, or 2, or 1.
Delegate Moon?
With respect to the question about cost, I had looked into this issue in the past, and my recollection in document bulk is that if the county wants to do this, the vendors do have the capability. There would be it would be a cost to switching to this, but if you did the change in conjunction with the next time you're putting out some sort of procurement or something like that, the cost would be less than trying to get it done, just immediately. But I assume that's something if the county chooses to do it, they can game out that time.
Delegate Lopez?
So I remember when we had the local bill hearing in Rockville, the concept of methodology changing the results came up, and it looks like that's been addressed in the second paragraph under background on the last line. In the case of this bill, the county council is given broad latitude to determine the procedure for tabulating votes. So does that mean that the county council determines the methodology before the voting occurs, or does that mean in the case of, like, if the tabulating can differ, does that mean, like, they come in afterwards to make a decision?
No, they would determine ahead of time exactly which type of RCV or approval they wanted to implement. There would have to be significant lead time because the Board of Elections needs significant lead time to implement a new voting system. And because the amendment that Delegate Queen proposed, which was added, requires a public information campaign to explain whatever system is being used. In talking with council members, it seems likely that what would happen is that the council would appoint a local commission to investigate various options, make recommendations to the council, and the council would choose a format if they chose to go down this one.
And the State Board of Elections doesn't need to approve it, it could just be implemented?
It could be, under this bill, it could be implemented. The State Board of Elections would have a role in working on the technical aspects, particularly having to do with voting systems.
Questions, comments, arguments? Delegate Queen?
Don't remember tonight. What, if any, opposition was there? I mean, I don't see any written opposition in my folder.
You probably don't have any opposition in your folder because all the opposition would come via email. There was no one who testified at our hearing.
Okay, that's what I couldn't remember.
In fairness, however,
Concern.
sorry, I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Thank you. In fairness, however, the local and state Republican Party have taken a position of opposition to these bills.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Barback.
Well, if we really want to be fair, there were a couple of people at the work session holding up signs opposing RCV. No, we don't want to do that there.
Other questions, comments, arguments? And the bill was moved.
I was just curious as to what those arguments were.
Oh, you leak it?
I hesitate to because I don't want to put words in their mouth. I think there is concern from some voters just about simply shifting how we vote, and concern that the sort of real conservative argument that we've been doing the type of balloting we've been doing for a long time, why change it? I think there's for a lot of grassroots Republicans, more immediate concern that's come out of a congressional race in Maine, where the tabulation of ranked choice voting in the second round resulted in a Republican candidate who was ahead in the first round losing the election as the votes were retabulated in the runoff. So I think there are some who believe that this would lead to more members of certain parties being elected. In my opinion, it would not. It is, from a partisan perspective, neutral. It is just as likely that a Republican or a Green or Libertarian candidate would benefit from it as a Democratic candidate, in my opinion.
Delegate Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To also address Delegate Love's question, I remember from the hearing a few other issues that came up. I think part of it was the voter education, voter confusion, helping my elderly mother vote. It's hard enough to vote the current ballot. So I think voter confusion is a piece of it. I think that ties into the need for more judges potentially at certain locations or others. I cost concerns potentially with our state board. And then my particular concern is the transparency in a recount. I think of all people to ask a question about a recount. I visited Delegate Love, I think the night it came out plus 11, so a very exciting night. But the transparency, right now people see the system and how it works, but I think when they see the results and then weeks later finding out the results and the transparency and understanding it, I think that gives people concern. I think there's a lot of pluses of these systems, but I think there have been some legitimate concerns brought up.
Delegate Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that I would just highlight on the issue about what happened in Maine, and for folks who haven't been following it, I think what happened in Maine, not just because I'm pleased that Democrat won, and that has nothing to do with what I'm pleased about what happened in Maine, but what it showed us was exactly what the strength of the system is, which is that you can have a third party participate and you don't have sort of the spoiler effect. And so if we look at the Bush-Gore race and questions about what might have happened in that race if folks who felt really strongly about sending a message about their support for Nader, and if they had been able to do that but not have that be a wasted vote. And so what happened in Maine is people had a chance to say that their preference was whoever this third party candidate was, but they had a chance to kind of make that statement and then make sure that that wasn't a throwaway vote because they knew that person wasn't going to win, and then their second choice vote across the much larger group of their second choice vote was the Democrat. So that's what happened, and I think it's kind of gotten some confusing press, which has led to somehow this idea that ranked choice voting supports Democrats, but theoretically you could have a very different outcome. What ranked choice voting supports, in that case in particular, is people's ability to vote their first choice and who they really believe in and not have to worry about that being a wasted vote, and still make sure that they can get into place. And so I think, one of the things that I really like about ranked choice voting is maximizing voter voice. And I think that that's one of the ways that that played out, in maximizing voters' voice.
Chair Queen.
Well, I just wanted to kind of respond to some of the questions that the committee did look at a lot of the issues that may have been raised from emails that we received. We spent an extra week or so to make sure we understood some of the differences between this approach. But again, we looked at this as an enabling legislation. The idea that the county council would provide some sort of education campaign to educate the community before anything is implemented. That this would be a reasonable approach to address a change we should see people have been asking to see.
That was your question?
No, nothing.
Dr. Moon.
I'm sorry, this is the last thing I'll say.
Is that a comment, sir?
In this hour. So I know it's a foreign concept to some, but I did actually have the opportunity to go and do election monitoring in Scotland. When they have been using a rank system, Ireland and in the UK they do this, and I watched it on new electronic scanning equipment that they had just acquired. That was actually the purpose of the visit, was to look at the equipment, but it was using a rank system. And so all of these things that we're wondering about, how fast the tabulation is going to be, how transparent, etc., I've actually seen it demoed on very sophisticated equipment, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Tacoma Park is the opposite of that. It's very low tech. It's paper ballots, and you're writing it on scraps of paper, and the board's tabulating it. It's also transparent, very low tech. We have 16-year-olds voting in Tacoma Park, and the exit polls that were done on voter education and ranked choice voting after we've used it have showed even the 16-year-olds have been able to utilize the system on that. And lastly, we have had elections in Tacoma Park where the difference between the first choice and first place and second place candidate was smaller than the number of votes that the third place candidate got. In other words, we actually used the runoffs in Tacoma Park, and guess what? I don't believe the election outcomes typically change. So usually the person who's leading is going to end up winning the election even under a ranked choice system. I think that's very important to remember. This isn't changing those outcomes. It's in those very close races where there's potential for a spoiler problem that you might see the outcome flip between person 1 and 2. But in this county, I think that out of the 24 of us that were here now, I think only one person among us was in that situation. So it's really not as dramatic as I think the change that it might seem at first. And of course, the only reason we're having this conversation is because of unusual new constraints or problems facing the county after term limits and the public financing that we unleashed on the county to begin with. So I think it's okay to give them one more option to mitigate some of the things we did.
Chairman Barwick.
When you were in Scotland, did you visit any distilleries?
I did.
Do they require a tilt to observe?
I don't think they have production caps either.
The question is, what do they call their alcohol? Sorry. All right, the bill has been moved and seconded. We're going to do this as a roll call. Council, or Sarah, Council, we're just going to do it from the top.
Delegate Isabella?
I'm sorry?
So we're debating a bill here. Are you in favor?
Voting now, yes, yes.
Delegate Barber?
Yes.
Delegate Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Sharpia?
Yes.
Delegate Crutchfield?
Yes.
Delegate Collison?
Yes.
Delegate Dumas?
Yes.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo?
Yes.
Delegate Gilchrist?
Yes.
Delegate Kaiser?
Yes.
Delegate Kelly?
Yes.
Delegate Lopez?
Yes.
Delegate Love?
Yes.
Delegate Lutke?
Yes.
Delegate Moon?
Yes.
Delegate Palakovich Carr?
Yes.
Delegate Chief?
Yes.
Delegate Queen?
Yes.
Delegate Resnick?
Yes.
Delegate
Yes.
Delegate Solomon?
Aye.
Delegate Stewart?
Yes.
Delegate Wilkins?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Great, the bill obviously carries. Controversial roll call vote. Thank you, Chair Queen. We'll now move on to Metro Washington Area Committee report. Vice Chair Clark.
So from the Metro Washington Area Committee, MCPG 101-19 has been withdrawn. So the only bill that we are reporting out is MCPG 114-19. This is Senator Kramer's bill, WSSC Collective Bargaining Technical Unit. This bill received a unanimous favorable report without amendments from the committee. I would like to move the bill favorable.
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, all in favor of MC/PG 114-19, please say aye.
Aye.
Any noes? Any abstentions? Anything else? Great. Thank you, Chair Carr. We'll move on to Land Use, Transportation, and Public Safety. Chair Wilkins.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. The committee moved favorable on MC 10-19, vehicle laws prohibited acts at intersections. You may recall that this legislation prohibits a vehicle that's going through a green or yellow light to enter the intersection if the vehicle is unable to get through the intersection, get all the way through. So this is kind of don't block the box bill. It's important to note that for this bill, an officer can only issue a citation if the proper signage is there, so that there will be signage for the public to be aware that, don't block the box or you get a ticket. I do want to flag that the committee moved favorable on this bill with the understanding that we wanted to amend it to have the changes that are made in the statewide version. There's a statewide version of this as well. So I would like to give the opportunity for the bill sponsor to share those amendments because we do want to ensure the costs are defined and also make sure that there aren't any points associated. So that's the quick overview of the bill, and then Mr. Chair, I will go
Carr.
So in your packet is an amendment. So as the chair stated, there is also a statewide bill on this very same topic, and my preference is to pass the statewide bill, but we also have this local bill as a fallback. So the amendment conforms this local bill to the statewide bill in that it adds language stating that the preset fine amount is $90 and that there are no points. So I would move the amendment to conform it to the statewide bill that was heard yesterday.
Any discussion or questions about the amendment? All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Noes? Any abstentions? Chair Queen? Chair Wilkins.
So that is the bill we'd like to move favorable, and committee to consider our move favorable.
Any discussion on the bill as amended? Great. All those in favor of MC 10 I apologize. Delegate Shetty.
Hi. Sorry. Thanks. Thank you to the committee for your great work on this really important bill. I think it's a really important piece of legislation for pedestrian safety as well as just kind of keeping traffic moving. One question, and I don't know if this came up in subcommittee, but has there been any discussion around what would happen in the event of a vehicle that is sort of almost like in the intersection because of emergency egress? So like say there's a police car or fire vehicle or something that forces the car into the intersection, and then as a result, the car can't make it through the intersection before the light turns red. I think in those instances, we clearly wouldn't want the person ticketed. Just kind of want to put that out there for consideration and question.
So that's a great question. So the part about us discussing that in committee, we did not discuss it, but the bill passed statewide previously, so it might have been a part of the discussion. My understanding is that when you contest a ticket, one of your defenses is that if there was an emergency vehicle, that's one of the reasons that you can contest a ticket. But I want to invite, I know we have the wonderful chairman in the room, so I want to invite everyone else who might know.
I mean, we discussed this a bit in my committee, and the feeling is that a police officer would probably not issue a ticket if a person got into the box because they were letting an ambulance or a police officer by.
No discussion or questions? Delegate Chief.
I'm just wondering about the enforcement of that. Is it up to a personal judgment to say driving out of time to adequately make a turn or finish crossing? Right.
Yeah, so the person is making that decision on if they have time to go through, and if the light is turning yellow, and you decide, well, let me try to make it. If there's signage that says don't block the box, and an officer pulls you over and cites you for that, that's when this will come into play. But it's a personal judgment that people make. Can I make the light? And it's a safety issue in terms of Montgomery County, our Vision Zero, around pedestrian safety and things like that. When people make that decision to try to go through, I would say especially on yellow, but the bill applies to just in general, can you safely make it?
Do you rely on speed cameras and intersections?
We can't hear, I'm sorry.
I think the question was about cameras.
Are we going to rely on cameras and so forth to enforce, to monitor?
Delegate Carr? Or, no. Delegate Carr, go ahead.
I was just going to say this bill does not provide for cameras or automated enforcement.
Sure, Bart.
That's basically what I was going to say.
It's almost like you served on your committee for a few years.
Yeah.
Other questions or discussion? Okay, the bill was moved and seconded. All in favor of MC 10-19 as amended, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any noes? Any abstentions or no? Great. No passes. All right, voting session, MC 2-19, Montgomery County Department of Liquor Control, Delegate Stewart.
This bill was passed out, thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill was passed out of our local economic development committee yesterday on a 5-0 vote. It is MC 219, Montgomery County Department of Liquor Control renaming. You may remember from the public hearing back in the fall, or I guess maybe early winter in Rockville, that the county has requested to rename the currently called Montgomery County Department of Liquor Control, also sometimes known as the DLC, to the Montgomery Alcohol Beverage Services. The county feels that this name better reflects the mission of the department, both because control, the word control has a negative connotation, and because the DLC deals with all kinds of alcohol and not just liquor. So once again, it passed unanimously 5-0 in our committee and I move the bill.
Second.
Any discussion? Delegate Lukey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be voting against the bill. I think it reflects a part of, there is, I think, still a part of the alcoholic beverage discussion we haven't gotten into in delegation, and I think this reflects that, which is that our DLC, soon to be ABS, has two slightly conflicting missions. On the one hand, they are responsible for enforcing liquor control, making sure that liquor stores don't do things they're not supposed to be doing, like selling to minors and proliferate on every street corner. On the other hand, they have a mission of selling more alcohol because of their retail operation and distributing more alcohol because of their distribution operation. I think we need to have a serious discussion about separating those two functions in the future into separate county agencies, because I think having both of them in the same agency presents a bit of an inherent conflict of interest. And so I guess this is a little bit of a protest vote, because I still think that preventing negative consequences of alcohol should be a primary mission of the agency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In many, many ways, I agree with my colleague Delegate Lukey in what he just said. I have held this bill up for 2 to 3 weeks at this point, for a tangential reason, because a number of years ago, about 3 years ago, we passed as a delegation a bill that would allow the department to create what's called agency contracts, meaning licensed liquor sales through the private licensees, in addition to doing it through their own dispensaries, what they call their stores. We passed that bill. We heavily modified it from a bill that mandated a certain number of licenses to allowing flexibility for the department to determine how they should proceed. What has occurred in the last 3 years is nothing. They followed through on none of the plans that we had asked them to do. So for the last couple of weeks, I have been holding this bill up, understanding that it is tangentially related, not directly related. I have had numerous conversations with Bob Dorfman this week, the current head of the DLC. He has publicly promised me that we will re-examine the issue, that he will open it back up for consideration. I am currently in conversations with both the Montgomery County Retail Store Association as well as with DISCUS, which is the National Association for Liquor Companies, to see if we can identify private licensees in the state who would be interested in getting a contract. So we are having that discussion. I thank Mr. Dorfman for being open to it. As a result of that, I did vote yesterday in committee, along with everyone else, to approve this bill for the name change. But I do agree with Delegate Luki. We do need to look at possibly separating the functions, because it is very hard to regulate yourself while also competing with all of the people that you have to regulate. So I will be voting yes, because I appreciate the department's cooperation, and I think that that they are deserving of a yes vote in this case, and we'll see what happens moving forward.
Anybody else? Okay, the bill has been moved and seconded. All in favor of MC 2-19, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, raise their hands. Anyone taking the rule or abstaining? Are you, Delegate Cramps, are you abstaining?
Abstaining.
Delegate Asadero? Delegate Asadero, are you abstaining or taking the rule?
Abstaining.
Okay. Okay. All right, we're going to do the late file bill hearing on, thank you, Don, so on 113-19. I had a little bit of a miscommunication with Chairman Pinsky. He thought a conversation with me satisfied the expression of why the bill was late filed. He blamed his senator. So I would ask us to consider MC/PG 113-19 as a late filed bill. Anyone have any questions for me, since I'm here on behalf of Chairman Pinsky?
Are you moving that other bill? Is that what, I apologize, I missed what you were
Yeah, so we're doing we're hearing the late file request on 113-19. Chairman Pinsky and I had a miscommunication about whether or not he or someone needed to be here. I will be more clear in the future. So if anyone has any questions.
I do have a question.
Okay.
Do you know the history of this bill? My understanding is it's come before us many times before, and now it's late, so I'm a little uncomfortable about this bill.
Yeah, I have heard that it's been offered, maybe not always as an independent bill, but as amendments to other bills in the past. And I think that's a good reason to give it a very thorough hearing when we hear the bill, if it's accepted for late filing.
And Mr. Chairman, do we have thorough hearings here, or is this something we should be doing in Rockville and Upper Marlboro?
That's a fair point, Madam Chair. I'm a strong believer in following our own deadlines. In this case, I did have a miscommunication with Chairman Pinsky about whether he should be here to explain the bill and why it was late filed, so I hope we can have that conversation next week. We do stream our meetings now, so the great folks in Rockville and Upper Marlboro can watch us.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Delegate Lesnar.
Are you going to be consistent in voting against the bill that you just presented?
This is fun. Delegate Moon.
I just want to point out, I remember this bill because it got attached to a county delegation bill I introduced a year or two ago, dealing with child care, lowering the cost of child care. So you may have recalled there was some weird special ordering going on the floor on the eve of Sine Die. It was all related to this bill, so.
Delegate Moon, are any of your bills going to EV this year?
There.
Delegate Buck.
I apologize if you said this, but did Senator Pinsky say why it was late?
He claims he had a miscommunication with somebody. I think, as you will see, these are often very hazy reasons for why these bills are late, and it is very frustrating. I agree.
I can move to accept the bill as late.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Okay. You went no?
I went no.
Thank you. We'll vote, log rolling. Okay, committee announcements. Delegate Carr.
The Metropolitan Washington Committee will not meet on Monday.
Great. Delegate Wilkins.
Land use will be taking up the golf course bills on Tuesday, immediately after session room 318. So everyone be prepared.
Chair Queen.
There are no meetings for EDH until further notice.
Congratulations, Chair Queen. You've cleaned out your drawer before anybody else.
Thank you.
Chair Kelly.
We have one more meeting on Thursday, 9 a.m. on the Just Cause bill. We did consider it last week and adopted, this week and adopted some amendments. Alistair, do we have an interlineated version of that yet?
I'll get it later.
Okay, so if anyone is interested in looking at the amendments that were already adopted by the subcommittee on that, we should have that available later today, and Alistair will have that. Because we did adopt some significant amendments from the county council, et cetera, and we will be considering that next week in subcommittee again.
Any other announcements or questions? Great. Please return your purple folders. Thank you all.